There comes a moment, quiet, often painful, when you realize you were never truly seen, not as a person, not as a soul, but as a resource, a utility, a convenience. You gave freely, with heart, with time, with loyalty, and in return, you were overlooked, misunderstood, taken for granted. Not because you weren't valuable, but because your value was so constant, so dependable, that they stopped recognizing it altogether. You weren't weak. You were generous. You weren't blind. You were hopeful. But there's a cost to being used without shame. It changes you. It wakes something up in you. And while they may have lived comfortably in your light, they now sit in the shadow of their own regret. This is not just about betrayal. This is about awakening, about transformation, about what happens when the one they used becomes the one they can no longer reach. The tragedy of being taken for granted. It's a quiet kind of heartbreak, the kind that doesn't scream but echoes. You give yourself to others in the most human way possible. You show up. You answer the call. You forgive without being asked. You stay when no one else does. Not because you're trying to be a martyr, but because somewhere deep inside you believe that love, real love, means being there, even when it isn't easy. But over time, something shifts. What once felt like connection begins to feel like obligation. Your efforts, once met with gratitude, are now met with expectation. The things you once gave out of love are now demanded like duty. And you start to notice you're no longer a person to them, you've become a function. A background presence they assume will always be there. It's the tragic result of consistency in a world addicted to novelty. They stop asking how you feel. They stop noticing when you're tired. And eventually, you begin to ask yourself the one question that tears through the soul. If I stopped giving, would they still stay? That's the moment the illusion starts to shatter. Because being used isn't always loud. Sometimes it's disguised as being needed. But there's a vast difference between someone needing you and someone valuing you. And the most painful betrayal isn't always abuse. Sometimes it's just being invisible to the ones you would have done anything for. Exploitation breeds silence, then awakening. There's a moment, almost imperceptible, when your soul begins to go quiet. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've said everything and it fell into silence. You poured yourself into people who didn't have the capacity or the willingness to hold you. And when the weight of being overlooked becomes too heavy, you don't scream. You retreat. That's how it begins. Exploitation doesn't always come with chains or threats. Sometimes it wears a smile. It calls you friend. It says, I need you, but never, how are you? It celebrates your usefulness, not your humanity. It applauds what you do for them, not who you are beneath it all. And because you are someone who cares, someone who has built your life on empathy, patience, and hope, you stay. You keep showing up, you keep giving, you believe maybe this time they'll see, but they don't. And slowly, without ceremony, you begin to disappear from yourself. You become a shell, functioning, performing, surviving, while the deeper part of you whispers, this isn't love, this isn't loyalty, this is being used. And yet you stay silent. Why? Because silence for people like you isn't cowardice, it's reverence. You don't want to hurt others, you don't want to accuse or assume, you hold on to dignity. You tell yourself, they don't know what they're doing. You rationalize their behavior. You fill in the gaps. You carry the emotional weight. For two, But the silence doesn't protect you. It buries you until one day something breaks. It's not loud, it's not violent, it's not some great argument or dramatic exit. It's quiet, internal, a flicker of self-respect rising from the ashes of your exhaustion. And suddenly, you're no longer trying to convince them of your worth. And you're no longer handing out explanations or hoping they'll meet you halfway. You stop. You stop overextending. You stop waiting. You stop apologizing for needing what every human deserves: reciprocity. That's when the awakening begins. And make no mistake, it is an awakening, because you don't just wake up to them, you wake up to you. You remember who you were before you were drained. You remember the strength it took to keep loving even when you weren't being loved back. And you begin to realize that your silence was never weakness. It was the stillness before the transformation. That's what exploitation does to the soul. It tests the edges of your boundaries until you finally build new ones, stronger ones, clearer ones. Boundaries that say, I am not here to be used. I am not here to be your emotional sponge. I am not here to carry your life while mine collapses. You reclaim your time. You reclaim your energy. You reclaim your voice. And here's the part they never expect. The ones who used you, neglected you, leaned on you without care, they don't know how to respond to the new version of you. The version that doesn't answer every call. The version that doesn't say yes out of guilt. The version that doesn't chase, beg, or explain. They start to feel your absence. Not just physically, but energetically. Because people don't always recognize your presence when they're benefiting from it. They only recognize your absence when the benefit disappears. Suddenly, the silence they once ignored becomes a mirror, and they're forced to look into it. What do they see? Not just a loss, but a failure. Their failure to listen, to appreciate, to give, to show up. And that regret, it doesn't come all at once. It creeps in slowly. They begin to remember the things you did that no one else does. The messages you sent at just the right time. The way you noticed the details everyone else missed. The way you made space for them, even when you had none for yourself. That's the paradox of exploitation. It blinds people to the beauty of what they have until it's gone. And while they sit with that discomfort, that regret, that deep gnawing feeling of, I pushed away the one who truly cared, you are somewhere else entirely. You're healing. You're rebuilding. You're stepping into relationships that don't drain you, but nourish you. You're finding joy in solitude because for the first time, your silence is no longer a prison. It's peace. That's the part they don't get to see. They only see the door closing. They don't get to see what's behind it. Because this awakening, it isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving them wrong. It's about finally choosing yourself in a world that convinced you that you had to earn love through sacrifice. And you realize you were never too much. You were never too emotional, too sensitive, too intense. You were just too real for people who hadn't yet learned how to be honest with themselves. Let them sit in that. Let them wrestle with their choices. Because you've carried their weight long enough. Now it's your turn to walk freely, unburdened, awake, and finally home in yourself. Exploitation breeds silence, then awakening. Not all wounds bleed. Some are invisible. Some are etched into the soul through moments of quiet disregard, subtle selfishness, and patterns that repeat themselves until you begin to question your own worth. That's the nature of being used, not through overt malice, but through silent entitlement. You give because giving is who you are. You listen because you understand how rare that gift is. You stay, not because you're blind to the imbalance, but because you keep hoping they'll see what you've been offering all along. But they don't. And that's where the ache begins to grow. The people who used you likely didn't wake up one morning with the intention to exploit your goodness. Most of them simply grew comfortable. They learned that you would be there, that your yes came easily, that your boundaries were soft, that your heart was open, and they began to build their expectations on top of your sacrifices. What you gave as a gift became their baseline assumption. What cost you your energy, your time, and sometimes your emotional well-being was interpreted as just how you are. And you stayed silent. You swallowed your exhaustion. You suppressed the resentment. You rationalized their behavior because you didn't want to seem ungrateful, unkind, or dramatic. You told yourself, they're going through a lot, or maybe they don't know what they're doing. And maybe that's true. But the road to being used is often paved with your own unwillingness to speak up for fear of hurting them, or worse, being abandoned. This silence doesn't last forever. It begins as self-protection, but over time it becomes self-erasure. You start to feel like a ghost in your own relationships. You're present but not seen, needed but not nurtured. And eventually something inside you begins to stir, not in anger, at least not at first, but in sorrow, in realization. You begin to see the pattern. You begin to understand that the ones who lean on you so heavily rarely think to ask how you're holding up. That's when the awakening begins. And it often starts quietly. You don't slam the door. You don't make dramatic declarations. You just begin to reclaim small pieces of yourself. You start saying no where you once said yes. You choose rest instead of guilt. You stop over-explaining your needs. You pull back, not to punish, but to protect. And those who used to benefit from your silence will notice. They'll ask, what happened to you? They won't understand that what happened was not sudden, but gradual. You didn't change overnight. You remembered who you are. You remembered what it feels like to be treated with respect, not convenience. You remembered that relationships are supposed to be mutual, not one-sided performances. You remembered that love is not proven through depletion. And now that you're awakening, you're no longer content to be someone's afterthought. This shift, your awakening, does not come without cost. Some people will fall away. Some will grow angry. They were invested in the version of you that didn't ask for anything back, but that version was dying inside. And you know now that your peace is worth more than their approval. Those who used you, whether consciously or not, will come to feel the weight of your absence. Because when someone who once made life easier, brighter, safer, and more stable suddenly steps away, the void is undeniable. And that void has a voice. It speaks in silence. It speaks in moments when they wish they could call you, vent to you, lean on you, but you're no longer available in that way. And while they sit with that realization, something beautiful happens to you. You begin to feel light again, unburdened. You're no longer responsible for carrying what was never yours. You're no longer dimming yourself for the sake of someone else's comfort. The truth is, you were never weak, you were never naive, you were never too much. You were just surrounded by people who benefited from your silence and called it peace. But now you see clearly. Now you're awake, and that awareness will shape every step you take forward. Regret arrives when the well runs dry. People rarely notice the well while it's full. They come to it again and again, expecting water, expecting nourishment, expecting it to always be there. And the tragedy is many of them never ask where that water comes from. They don't consider what it costs the well to stay full. They don't think about what it takes for someone like you to keep showing up day after day, offering care, support, attention, and presence. To them, your love wasn't a miracle, it was a utility. That's how the slow erosion begins. You're there when no one else is. You answer the phone at 2 a.m. You notice when something's wrong without being told. You give your time, your energy, your heart over and over again, and they keep taking. Not with malice, not always with intent, but with assumption. They assume you'll always be there. They assume your kindness is endless. They assume your patience is a permanent feature of your personality, not something you've chosen day after day, even when it hurt. But everything has a limit. Even the ocean meets the shore. Even the sun sets. Even the most generous soul grows tired of being taken for granted. And one day they come back, thirsty as usual, and the well is dry. That's when the regret begins. Regret doesn't arrive during the taking. It comes in the absence. It comes in the silence. When your messages stop arriving. When your presence no longer fills the room with warmth. When your laughter is no longer heard. When your advice is no longer given. When your support is no longer offered freely. That's when they realize what you were. Not just a person, but a source. A source of steadiness in their chaos, a source of love in their emptiness, a source of stability in their storms. But by then it's too late, because you've changed. The version of you that gave endlessly, that hoped, forgave, and carried more than your share is gone, not out of bitterness, but out of growth. You learned that love without boundaries isn't love. It's self-abandonment. And so you stopped giving to those who only knew how to take. You stopped pouring into cups that never once refilled yours. And they feel that loss like a phantom limb. Regret is a haunting thing. It doesn't show up all at once. It creeps in slowly, in moments. It hits them when they go to call you, only to remember they haven't heard from you in weeks. It stings when they have good news and instinctively think of you, but hesitate, because the bond is broken. It digs in when they realize that everyone else they leaned on eventually left, but you stayed the longest and they still pushed you away. Regret doesn't just say, I miss you. It says, I failed you. That's the real weight of it. Because when someone uses you long enough, they come to believe they're entitled to you. They don't see your giving as generosity. They see it as routine. And when that routine breaks, when your care is no longer accessible, they begin to understand how deeply they miscalculated, how they mistook your love for convenience, how they treated your loyalty like a guarantee instead of a gift. And while they wrestle with that reality, you've moved on, not with anger, but with clarity. You no longer feel the need to explain why you left or how long you held on. You don't replay the past, trying to make sense of it. You understand now that it was never your job to make someone recognize your value. Your only job was to offer your love honestly, and when it wasn't respected, to let go with dignity. You are no longer the well, you are the river. You move, you grow, you carve new paths, and the people who once stood at your edge, expecting you to stay still, now watch as you flow far beyond their reach. At the sting of regret, it doesn't just hurt because they lost you. It hurts because they realize you would have stayed if they had only seen you, chosen you, appreciated you, but they didn't. And now, the silence you leave behind speaks louder than anything you ever said. Regret arrives when the well runs dry, but you are no longer empty. You are full of lessons, of strength, of quiet power. And this time you give to yourself first.